Thanks so much for inviting me on the report to share with you and your viewers about domestic minor sex trafficking in the United States from a social work perspective. To go ahead and get started, I'm going to explain what domestic minor sex trafficking, DMST, is. DMST is the exploitation of children by selling, buying, or trading sexual services such as pornography, stripping, or prostitution, etc. All of these things qualify as DMST. Under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, some of the things that they look for is force, fraud, and coercion. But when it comes to minors, it doesn't matter if this minor is being exploited. Minors don't have to have those three things. The exploitation itself counts for this is human trafficking. So this act is in favor and helpful for minors, victims of domestic minor sex trafficking. Unfortunately, misidentification is one of the key challenges when we're talking about domestic minor sex trafficking. So unfortunately, they may not get the help or the interventions that they need or that they deserve as minors. But this is something that we're working towards better and adequate intervention, as well as training for individuals who will encounter domestic minor sex trafficking victims, such as social workers, healthcare providers, and people who are part of the justice system. So those are just a few overviewing things about domestic minor sex trafficking. The next thing is to acknowledge the issue. Domestic minor sex trafficking is happening right now in the United States in every major city. It is not this far-off foreign issue that's in third world countries that I think is a misconception that some of society has, because they think, oh, that's something that happens in a really impoverished, poor leadership country. Unfortunately, that is not the case. It is happening right here. It is an American issue. There are over 300,000 victims of domestic minor sex trafficking right now in the United States that we know of. And about 1 in 3 teenage runaways will be lured into prostitution within 48 hours of leaving their home. So within 2 days of saying, I'm running away, they can be lured into this cycle of abuse and trauma. So this is a big issue that we need to take into consideration. And I think the biggest statistic that definitely brings the point home for me, and I hope it'll bring the point home for you and your viewers, is the average age of a domestic minor sex trafficking victim is 13. A 13-year-old is about your average 7th grader. So close your eyes and imagine a 7th grader. That is the face of a domestic minor sex trafficking victim. So this young child who doesn't have a whole lot of life experience for the most part is entering to this world of trauma, abuse, and slavery. So understanding these facts, it's important for us to get a baseline of what domestic minor sex trafficking is, so that way we can learn more about it and then how to better have prevention measures, and how we as a society and also how social workers can come together to help impact this situation in a positive way. So one of the things that I think is really important for us to talk about is 4 states in the United States. These states are California, Texas, Florida, and Ohio. Ohio has a study done in the Toledo area where a great percentage, about 70% of the domestic minor sex trafficking victims, if they didn't receive proper intervention, they actually ended up becoming a part of adult prostitution. So when you look at that and you understand the correlation that many adults were actually victims at one time and they've grown up through this cycle. So understanding that gives us a little bit different a perspective, and also understanding the human rights aspect. So social workers have a code of ethics that they follow, and part of this code of ethics is a commitment to the human rights for all people and empowerment for vulnerable and oppressed populations. Victims of domestic minor sex trafficking definitely fit this criteria. So they do need social workers to work on their behalf and work with them in order to address this issue. So going back to talking about domestic minor sex trafficking, we need to talk about some risk. So there's individual risk, relational risk, community risk, and societal risk. So people who are at a higher risk for this is your LGBT plus communities, youth who experience homelessness, poverty, youth who are victims of child sexual abuse. Things like this all affect and become higher risk factors for these youth to become victims of domestic minor sex trafficking, because traffickers use these things to lure and create bonds and relationships with these victims so that they can actually get them into human trafficking. One of the greatest ways that traffickers do this is through social media. So most teenagers that I know have a phone. And most of them don't have the flip phone razors that I had when I didn't get a phone until I was 15. But most of them don't have that kind of phone. They have an iPhone, a Galaxy, a HTC, some kind of smartphone that they have access to the internet on. And most teenagers have one of these three apps: Snapchat, TikTok, or Instagram. And these social media platforms are ways that youth can be lured into sex trafficking, but it's also ways that they can buy and sell victims of domestic minor sex trafficking. So it's really important to understand the power of social media and how it can be used against children, sometimes without them even knowing it. A lot of times traffickers will pry on vulnerable youth and make them promises about a better life, how things can be better with them, and give them gifts and start building this bond. And then they, in return, they want that child to be sex trafficked for them. So we need to understand the correlation of that. There's also the next things are neighborhoods and bars and clubs. Teenagers don't really frequent bars and clubs as much, but social media, they're on those things. But in neighborhoods, especially in neighborhoods that are really impoverished or have a lot of violence and lower socioeconomic statuses, they tend to be at higher risk. So we need to understand those things and better equip those communities to be aware of sex traffickers and to be vigilant. Those three things are the main ways that they will try to lure victims in sex trafficking. So the next thing that I really want to talk about is Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So one of the things that this act tries to do is prevention, protection, prosecution, and also partnership with the community to put a stop to domestic minor sex trafficking and human trafficking in general. And this act is an important piece of legislation to help protect victims. But it has been altered over time to better help victims. And it is something that social workers continually need to stay on top of and advocate for the best possible intervention and solutions and prevention for victims. it's very important to understand that this is not a one day victim, one day a normal person, then a victim, and now your intervention. It's not. It's a prolonged process, and many of the victims have had a grooming process, and they form their traffickers form bonds, and it's they mentally, emotionally, and physically abuse these victims. So working through all of that takes time, and it takes specialty. So social workers are really good at noticing those things and helping advocate on behalf of these people who are victims, and also for us to really go beyond just the acts of prosecution of people who are sex traffickers, but help these victims beyond just the sex trafficking aspect, but for their life after this. They've been dependent on another person and their sex trafficking to provide their life, their home, their safety for quite some time. So it's important to understand that. The next thing that I want to talk about just a little bit is COVID-19 and its effect of sex trafficking in the United States. So schools closed for the most part in March all over the United States. And we tend to notice social issues that people face when schools close because schools meet a lot of the social needs of kids. So most people don't really understand that there are children who are hungry in the United States because schools meet that need. So when the pandemic became a United States issue as well, excuse me, there was lots of organizations like Big Brothers Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Club, United Ways coming together to get food for these families, which is really important. But another aspect that we really need to look at in a time of pandemic is abuse within families, and also domestic minor sex trafficking has the great potential to increase due to stressors. So stressors in life, a lot of people lost their jobs, some people have lost their homes, etc. during this time, and these are stressors that add stress to the family that can in turn turn to abuse, which can in turn turn vulnerable populations to even more vulnerable populations due to this pandemic occurring, which makes people who are suffering have a greater chance to use alternative means to meet their needs. So children may be bought and sold by their own family members or friends, and also children are more likely to run away and have issues like that when there's a lot of internal and family and household stressors. So COVID-19 is affecting not only the health society, but it's also affecting the emotional society, children here, mental health. There's a lot of things that COVID-19 is affecting. So it's really important for us to address these needs, right? The last thing that I really want to talk about is justice. How can we seek justice for victims of domestic minor sex trafficking? I think that social workers are the best equipped people to help seek justice for victims of domestic minor sex trafficking. And here's why. Social workers are specially educated and trained to intervene on behalf of victims of many forms of abuse, many forms of human rights violations, and also your vulnerable and oppressed populations. Also, social workers, many of them have inside looks into these societies because they work with them on a daily basis. So the greatest thing that I think that social workers can do is to advocate. And that's the thing that sets social workers apart from any other helping profession, is that we advocate on behalf of our clients. So advocate for better laws, advocate for better instillment of the TVPA, right? All these things are things that we can advocate for to help these victims. The next thing that we can do is to educate. Coming on shows like this are a great way to educate the general public about an issue that's not always highlighted in society, but also we can educate our law enforcement officers, our healthcare providers, teachers, summer camp staff, etc., of what to look for and how to best approach situations like this with victims of domestic minor sex trafficking. It's really important for us to look at these things from a cultural humility perspective. So a lot of times when people see prostitution, the first thing that they see is prostitution, which I think that we should look well beyond that, and why is this person in this situation? And many of them have been victims since childhood, and this is the first time that we can truly get an intervention and help to this person in. So I think if we can better train other helping professions and people who provide services, social workers can be a great advocate for that. The next thing is to one-on-one help these victims. Social workers have this really cool aspect of being, they can work on the macro scale of like legislation, and they can work on the meso scale, which is like working with small groups to like training police officers on how to better handle situations such as domestic minor sex trafficking. But they can also work on the micro scale, which is helping these clients who have been victims. Many of them, their housing, their food, and their livelihood was provided through the sex trafficking. So if we can find ways to help these people, it's really important for us to do that. And so as social workers, we're specially trained individuals to help these clients. And we're specially trained individuals to work with these clients, right? To make the world a little bit better and have a little bit more hope for them and help them to be able to one day be able to thrive on their own. So my challenge to you guys as a society is to look for warning signs of domestic minor sex trafficking. And some of those warning signs would be a much older significant other. So specifically girls having a much older boyfriend, that's a red flag, okay? And then trauma can cause a change of mood and behavior. So we really need to take into consideration that if someone's mood is changing and their behavior is changing, this is a really big warning sign, right? And then we need to talk about if they have a profile or an internet presence on media that is sexually explicit, that could be another red flag for you. Having expensive belongings that they can't afford or account for, there's a great chance that their trafficker had bought that for them. And it may even be before that person is actually being trafficked. It may be in the grooming process. And also having a history or testing with multiple sexually transmitted infections is another key warning sign, especially for people who are young. Like 13 years old is very young for these things. So if we're looking at that, we can understand that. Bringing back us being in a pandemic state, one of the people who see patterns, they understand routines, and they can see change in behavior, and they're trained for that, is educators. So as being in a pandemic and students not having access to school, one of the greatest reporters and observers of the possibility of abuse or maybe even possible sex trafficking of children, they haven't had access to their students. So it's important for us as a society to be alert and to understand that this is an important issue that our world is facing. Domestic minor sex trafficking is growing. And it is up to us as a society, and it is up to me as a social worker to be dedicated and committed to helping prevent and encourage for the prosecution of traffickers, as well as supporting victims. Victims need our support now and far after they have been found. Thank you so much, Donna, for having me on your show. I appreciate you guys' time, and please understand that domestic minor sex trafficking is happening right now and is something that must be addressed. Thank you.